The last phone call came in at around 2:30 in the morning. A young woman's voice, frightened but trying not to sound it, telling her friend that someone was inside her apartment. She asked her friend to come. Then she called back a few minutes later and said never mind, everything was fine. She had decided to stay. Those were the last words anyone who loved her would ever hear her speak. By the time morning came and a friend pushed open the apartment door, the scene inside was not just a crime, it was a message. A staged, calculated performance designed by a person who knew exactly what investigators would look for, and had spent the hours between that second phone call and daylight making sure they would look in the wrong direction. This is the story of what happens when a justice system stops looking for the truth and starts looking for a story that fits. It is the story of Deborah Sue Carter, who deserved better. And it is the story of two men who lost a combined 22 years of their lives because a small town in Oklahoma decided it already knew the answer before it had asked all the questions. Before we get into it, let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if stories like this one stay with you, make sure you're subscribed. Every name in these files deserves to be spoken. Ada, Oklahoma in 1982 was the kind of place where your reputation was the most valuable thing you owned and the most fragile. A town of 16,000 people in Pontotoc County, surrounded by agricultural land, a few shrinking factories, and an unemployment rate that was climbing alongside the national recession. The early 1980s were economically brutal across America, and small southern Oklahoma towns were absorbing those blows without the cushion that larger cities had. People stayed because they were from there, because their families were from there, because leaving required resources that the collapsing economy had stripped away. And in a town that size, everyone was watching everyone else, and what the town believed about you became, in the eyes of many, more reliable than anything a court could determine. Deborah Sue Carter had grown up in Ada. She was 21 years old in the fall of 1982, and she had recently done something that mattered to her more than it might sound. She had moved into her own apartment, a small garage unit, nothing lavish but hers. For the first time, she was living independently, paying her way through a combination of jobs that required more energy than most people could sustain. She bartended and waited tables at the Coachlight Club. She babysat for local families. She picked up odd work wherever she could find it. She wore a Western-style belt with her name engraved on it almost every day, and the regulars at the Coachlight knew her by it. Her mother described her as mischievous and full of life, a good girl with a strong sense of right and wrong. The people she worked with confirmed that she was known, liked, trusted. On the evening of December 7, 1982, Deborah worked her regular shift at the Coachlight. A Tuesday night in winter, economy struggling, and the bar closed earlier than usual. Among the people drinking there that night was a man named Glenn Gore, 22 years old, a familiar face in the community. He had come in with a friend named Ron West. Gore knew Deborah from previous visits. When the night ended and people filed out into the cold parking lot, Gore positioned himself next to Deborah's car and spoke to her through the window. Some of the people leaving behind him noticed and thought nothing of it. Two acquaintances saying goodnight. Others looked more carefully. They saw Deborah push Gore back and pull her door shut. She drove away alone. Gore went back inside, then left with his friend. What the witnesses could confirm ended at that parking lot. What happened after Deborah drove away, only one person ever knew completely. At some point between midnight and 3 in the morning, Deborah called her friend Gina Vieta. She said someone was in the apartment with her and she was uncomfortable. She asked Gina to come pick her up. When Gina asked who was there, Deborah didn't answer directly. She said, "Hold on." Gina heard movement, sounds she couldn't identify through the line. Then she said she was on her way. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. Deborah, saying not to bother coming, she had decided to stay home. When Gina pressed her on who was there, Deborah redirected the conversation. "Call me in the morning," she said. "I don't want to be late for work." Gina never called in the morning, because by morning, Deborah was already gone. Around 11:30 that morning, a longtime friend named Donna Johnson came to the apartment to visit. She found the bedroom. She ran. She contacted the Carter family. Deborah's father, Charlie Carter, arrived first, climbing the outside stairs to the second-floor unit. He stopped at the landing. Broken glass covered the stairway floor. Both the screen door and the main door were wide open. He stepped inside. A blood-soaked towel was stuffed into his daughter's mouth. He called the police. Detective Dennis Smith was among the first investigators to enter. The paramedics who followed him in were professionals trained to process disturbing scenes. One of them began vomiting before he could leave the bedroom. What they found was not simply a crime scene. It was a constructed narrative. Deborah's body was face down on the floor between the wall and the bed, unclothed except for white socks. Around her were the deliberate signatures of someone who had spent time after the violence, staging what they wanted investigators to find. Ketchup had been used to write a name across her back. Duke Graham. Nail polish had been used to write a word across her chest. Die. On the formica table across the room, also in ketchup, a message, misspelled. Don't look for us or else with us, and we written in the plural, a deliberate signal suggesting multiple perpetrators. The spelling error was the only thing the killer could not fully control, a crack in the performance that revealed the agitation underneath the calculation. A blood-soaked towel had been forced deep into her throat. An electrical cord and a belt were found under her body. A ketchup bottle, uncapped, was found wrapped in a crumpled sheet near her. A shampoo bottle, also uncapped, showed evidence of being used in ways that the autopsy would later have to account for. The bracelet on her wrist was still there. Money was scattered on the floor, not taken, not evidence of robbery, but placed as another piece of the scene's constructed story. The glass on the landing. When crime scene specialists examined it, they found something that a real break-in from the outside would not have produced. The glass had landed both inside and outside the window frame, which meant it had been broken from both directions, staged to create the appearance of forced entry. A person had deliberately broken a window to suggest someone had come in from outside, the same person who wrote in plural. The same person who left a name on a dead woman's back as a false signpost. The autopsy told the truth. The scene was trying to obscure. Bruises covered Deborah's face, forehead, cheeks, jaw, the back of her neck, bite marks inside her mouth, defensive wounds on her arms, a ligature mark around her throat, small unexplained puncture marks on her nose and cheeks, a bottle cap discovered internally. She had fought with everything she had, and the cause of death was the towel, combined with the ligature. Someone had stood in that room long enough to do all of this, then stood longer to stage the scene around her, and then left. Investigators collected 17 hairs from around the body and the bedroom, body fluid samples from the rape kit, and a bloody fingerprint pressed against the bedroom wall. Those items went into evidence storage. They would stay there for 5 years. Ronald Keith Williamson had been the kind of young man that small towns build mythology around. Born in Ada in 1953, he grew up in the same community where Deborah Carter would later work the coachlight. He played baseball with a talent so obvious it carried him all the way to a national draft selection in 1971, taken in the 41st round, signed into the New York Yankees organization. He pitched and caught in the minor leagues through the mid-70s, close enough to the major leagues to make it real, before a shoulder injury ended everything. He came home. At 24 years old, with the dream finished and nothing structured to replace it, Williamson began the slow deterioration that untreated mental illness and unprocessed loss produce in a person. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and severe depression, conditions that were never properly addressed medically and that he managed instead with alcohol and whatever else he could access. He lived with his mother. He had no steady work. He mowed neighbors' lawns without being asked. He sang on the streets at night. He showed up at wrong places at wrong times in the ways that untreated psychiatric illness tends to manifest, conspicuously, erratically, memorably. In a town of 16,000 people, he became a story people told, not with malice necessarily. With the comfortable distance that comes from watching someone fall and deciding their falling is their own fault. He drank at the Coachlight Club, the same bar where Deborah Carter worked, the same bar where Glenn Gore was drinking on December 7, 1982. Dennis Fritz occupied a completely different position in the world. He was a high school science teacher. He had a stable job, a daughter he was raising, no criminal record, nothing in his background that pointed toward violence. He and Williamson had become friends in 1981 and spent evenings at the Coachlight together. That friendship, that common bar, that proximity, was the full extent of his connection to what happened to Deborah Carter. It turned out to be enough to destroy 11 years of his life. In March of 1983, 3 months after the murder, Glenn Gore walked into the Ada Police Department and told investigators that he had seen Williamson at the Coachlight the night Carter was killed, and that Williamson had been bothering her. Police called Williamson in. He denied involvement, cooperated fully, and voluntarily provided hair and saliva samples. The behavior of someone who believed he had nothing to conceal. His mother told investigators he had been home before 10 in the evening on December 7th, before the bar even closed, before Gore stood at Carter's car window in the parking lot. There was no physical evidence placing Williamson at the scene. Gore, the man doing the pointing, left the police station having provided no fingerprints, no hair samples, no saliva, not a single biological sample in 5 years of investigation. The man described by Coachlight witnesses as pressing himself against Deborah Carter's car until she physically pushed him away walked free from a murder investigation without leaving anything of himself behind. Even as investigators began focusing on Williamson, 3 pieces of evidence existed that contradicted the direction they were traveling. In 1983, a fingerprint specialist from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation named Jerry Peters examined the bloody print on the bedroom wall and concluded it did not belong to Carter, did not belong to Williamson, did not belong to Fritz. That finding was not shared with the defense. That same year, after Williamson submitted to a polygraph and provided an exculpatory statement on video, the tape was kept by the district attorney's office and never disclosed. And a man named Ricky Joe Simmons went to police and confessed to killing Deborah Carter. That confession was also kept and never disclosed. 3 separate pieces of evidence capable of redirecting the investigation or dismantling the prosecution. All 3 disappeared into the files of Pontotoc County District Attorney Bill Peterson and stayed there. The community's pressure had been building for 5 years by the time 1987 arrived. An unsolved murder in a 16,000-person town where everyone knew the victim's name and the story had been passed along long enough to acquire its own shape. Peterson moved. In May of 1987, he ordered the exhumation of Deborah Carter's body under the stated rationale of obtaining fresh fingerprints. The bloody print on the bedroom wall was re-examined by Jerry Peters, the same expert who had concluded in 1983 that it matched no one connected to the case. This time, Peters reached the opposite conclusion. The fingerprint now matched Carter. Same examiner, same piece of evidence. 24 years of professional history on one side, and a conclusion that arrived exactly when the prosecution needed it on the other. No scientific explanation was ever offered for the reversal. Williamson and Fritz were arrested in May of 1987. Fritz had no alibi, not because he had done anything to hide, but because 5 years had erased most people's memories of a routine Tuesday night. That absence of memory became the shape into which the prosecution would pour its theory of guilt. Fritz's trial came first, in April of 1988. He sat at the defense table as a man with no criminal record, no motive that anyone could identify, and no physical evidence placing him at the apartment. The prosecution relied on microscopic hair analysis and the testimony of a jailhouse informant who claimed to have heard Fritz confess while both were awaiting trial. That informant's testimony appeared in the case exactly 1 day before the prosecution would have been legally required to release Fritz for insufficient evidence. 1 single day, the jury convicted him. Life without parole. Ronald Williamson went to trial on April 21, 1988, and what occurred in that courtroom over the following days stands as one of the most thoroughly documented failures of the American justice process in the modern era. Williamson was represented by a blind attorney without the support staff or resources and adequate defense required. No motion was filed to evaluate his mental competency before the trial began. This was not an oversight in the way that forgetting to file paperwork is an oversight. Williamson was in an active psychotic state. He screamed at the judge. He overturned furniture. He lost control of himself repeatedly in front of the jury, not because he was performing, but because untreated schizophrenia in a high-stress environment produces exactly those behaviors. The jury watched it and read it as proof of dangerous character rather than as symptoms of a medical condition, because no one in that courtroom was required to explain the difference. The prosecution's star witness was Glenn Gore, the man described by Coachlight witnesses as being physically pushed away from Deborah Carter's car window in the parking lot the night she was killed. The man who had left police questioning without providing a single biological sample. The man who had initiated the investigation's focus on Williamson by going to police in 1983 with his account of what he claimed to have seen. Gore took the stand, placed his hand on a Bible, and told the jury he had witnessed Williamson bothering Carter at the Coachlight on December 7th. Of the 23 other people confirmed to have been at the bar that night, not one corroborated that account, not one. Gore alone placed Williamson there that evening, and Gore was the only person in the entire case whose presence at the scene had been corroborated by multiple independent witnesses. The prosecution built its case on 4 categories of evidence, and each one was, in different ways, a construction that the truth would eventually dismantle. The first was the hair analysis. Forensic specialist Melvin Hett testified that 13 of the 17 hairs collected from the crime scene were microscopically consistent with Fritz and Williamson, and that one was a match. Those phrases have the architecture of science. They imply precision, comparison, certainty. What they actually described was a visual similarity between hairs under a microscope, a comparison that could apply equally to tens of thousands of people with similar hair color and texture. The defense attorneys did not challenge it. The jury heard it as proof. In 2012, the FBI formally acknowledged that microscopic hair analysis had never been validated as a reliable forensic science, that experts across the country had for decades testified to conclusions that the method could not actually support, and the agency initiated a review of thousands of cases. In 1988, in Ada, none of that was yet known by anyone except the scientists who were choosing not to say it. The second category was the jailhouse informant testimony. Carrie Holland, who had shared a cell block with Williamson during an earlier incarceration in 1984 and 1985, testified that she had heard him describe Carter's death in ways she characterized as a confession. She said the word dream was used, but that the account crossed into something more than a dream. For Fritz, a separate inmate testified to having overheard a confession during his pretrial detention. The timing of that testimony arriving the day before Fritz would have had to be released says everything that needs to be said about how the American jailhouse informant system operates. People tell prosecutors what they need to hear in exchange for things they need to receive. The transaction is rarely visible from the jury box. The third category was the most extraordinary piece of evidence in any wrongful conviction case in modern American history. In 1984, while Williamson was briefly incarcerated on a check-writing offense, he told a detective about a dream. In that dream, he described following Deborah Carter home from the coach light and watching events unfold. He was explicit that he was describing a dream. He was explicit that in the dream, he occupied the role of the investigator, not the perpetrator. He described himself observing, not acting. At the 1988 trial, the prosecution presented that account to the jury without the frame of the dream, without the clarification that Williamson had cast himself as the detective in the scenario, and told the jury they were hearing a confession. No documented wrongful conviction in the modern American legal record has ever involved a person being sentenced to death based on the narrated contents of his own dream. The fourth category was the evidence that was never presented because Peterson had ensured it would not be. The exculpatory videotape. Simmons's confession. The original fingerprint finding. Brady v. Maryland, established by the Supreme Court in 1963, requires prosecutors to disclose all evidence favorable to the defense. Peterson withheld 3 separate pieces of evidence that each, independently, could have redirected or destroyed the prosecution's theory. Not one violation. 3. On April 27, 1988, the jury returned a verdict of guilty for Ronald Keith Williamson. The sentence was death. The man who had been the pride of Ada's baseball fields, drafted at 18 into professional baseball, was going to death row for a murder the real killer had already confessed to, and the forensic evidence would eventually exclude him from entirely. The Oklahoma State Penitentiary's death row facility was an underground structure. No windows, no sunlight, no connection to the world above. Williamson's cell was roughly the size of a parking space. He went weeks without showering. He barely ate. In that underground isolation, without psychiatric treatment, with untreated schizophrenia worsening daily under solitary confinement, he paced and screamed about his innocence in ways that people who didn't understand mental illness could dismiss as madness. Some guards had found a use for the intercom system that connected each cell to the guard station. After the lights went out, a voice would come through the speaker in Williamson's cell. The voice claimed to be God. It asked why he had killed Debbie Carter. Williamson was a devout Christian in an active psychotic state who could not reliably distinguish between what was real and what his illness was manufacturing. He would scream for hours after those whispers. The guards who ran that game were never disciplined. No one in the institution identified it as a problem that required intervention. While this was happening underground in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, Dennis Fritz was doing the only constructive thing he could do from a prison cell. He was writing letters. He contacted the Innocence Project, the nonprofit organization established in 1992 specifically to use DNA evidence to examine wrongful conviction cases. He understood something critical. The physical evidence from Deborah Carter's apartment, the 17 hairs, the rape kit samples, had been preserved. It still existed, and if modern DNA analysis was applied to it, the results would tell a story that the 1988 trial had not told. He also understood that before any of that could happen, he had to keep the evidence from being destroyed. He filed a motion to preserve the physical materials, a strategic move without which the entire exoneration might never have occurred. On September 27, 1994, Ronald Williamson was scheduled to die. On September 22, 5 days before that date, his public defender filed a habeas corpus petition in federal court. A stay of execution was granted. When the news reached Williamson in the underground facility, he screamed 3 words repeatedly from behind the bars. "I am innocent, I am innocent, I am innocent," not the declaration of a disturbed man performing for guards. The scream of someone who had just discovered he was not going to be executed in 5 days for something he did not do. 5 days. That is how close the Ada, Oklahoma justice system came to executing an innocent man. 5 days is a number that the people responsible for that case have to carry. The federal habeas petition led to an order for a new trial for Williamson in 1995. The ruling from the federal judge laid out precisely what Peterson and the system had done. The exculpatory videotape had never been disclosed, violating Brady. Simmons's confession had never been disclosed, a second Brady violation in the same case. Williamson's defense attorney had been constitutionally ineffective for failing to request a mental competency evaluation and failing to develop any evidence of his client's psychiatric condition. In 1997, Fritz received the same ruling. New trial ordered, same grounds. In 1999, Williamson's attorney Mark Barrett obtained the court's permission to apply DNA analysis to all physical evidence from the 1982 crime scene. The results arrived, and they were categorical. The 17 hairs that Melvin Hett had told the jury were microscopically consistent with Fritz and Williamson did not match either man. The intact biological samples from the rape kit did not match Fritz. They did not match Williamson. Every piece of biological evidence from the scene that could be tested pointed to one person, and that person was Glenn Gore, the man who had been at the coach light on December 7th, the man who had been seen at Carter's car window, the man who had walked away from 5 years of investigation without giving a single biological sample, the man who had stood before the 1988 jury as the prosecution's main witness and helped convict the men who were innocent of the crime he had committed. On April 15, 1999, Judge Tom Landreth dismissed all charges. Williamson and Fritz walked out of the courthouse. Williamson said 3 words to the judge before leaving. "Thank you, Judge." Fritz found his mother and his daughter at the press conference that followed. 11 years. He had missed 11 years of his daughter's life. He said there had been times of anger so deep it was hard to breathe through it, and that he had decided early on to try to make something out of the loss that could help prevent it from happening to someone else. The day before the exonerations, April 14th, the DNA results had become public knowledge. In an Oklahoma prison, Gore had been serving time on a completely unrelated conviction, 40 years for kidnapping and armed assault, while the 2 men whose lives he had helped destroy served their time in facilities across the state. When the DNA news broke, Gore understood what was coming. He escaped from a public work crew in Purcell. He had no real plan. There is no plan for that situation. He was recaptured quickly. In 2001, the Pontotoc County prosecutor charged him with the rape and murder of Deborah Sue Carter. On June 24, 2003, 21 years after the night, Deborah called Gina Vieta and said, "There's someone in my apartment, and I'm not comfortable." A jury convicted Glenn Gore. He received life without parole. The man who had used a dead woman's murder to redirect investigators away from himself for 17 years was convicted of that murder in the same county where 2 innocent men had been convicted in his place. Ronald Williamson was released in 1999 at 46 years old, and 11 years underground with untreated mental illness and the certain expectation of execution had done things to him that a court order could not undo. He returned to Ada and could not shake the certainty that police were coming back for him. He carried a pocket knife through the neighborhood, not from aggression, but because his mind had lost the capacity to reliably evaluate which threats were real. His family worked to keep him on medication. Alcohol interfered. He cycled through mental health facilities multiple times in the 5 years he was free. In his more stable periods, he stood outside prisons with other advocates calling for clemency for those still inside. A man who had been 5 days from execution now standing at the walls, asking for mercy for others. On December 4, 2004, Ronald Keith Williamson died at 51 years old in a nursing home in Oklahoma, his 2 sisters beside him. Cirrhosis. He had lived free for 5 years after the years in the underground facility had finished what the baseball injury had started. Dennis Fritz rebuilt. He returned to Missouri, found work, wrote a memoir in 2008 called Journey Toward Justice, and became an active member of the wrongful conviction advocacy community. He served on the board of the Midwest Innocence Project. He turned what was taken from him into a platform for making sure fewer people experienced the same thing. He received $500,000 in compensation from the city of Ada. The state of Oklahoma settled separately. On March 10, 2024, Dennis Fritz died at 74 years old. There is one moment after the exoneration that exists outside the normal logic of these stories. Deborah Carter's mother, Peggy Carter Sanders, who had buried her daughter and then watched 2 innocent men convicted in her daughter's killer's place, formed a relationship with Dennis Fritz in the years following the exoneration. At an Innocence Project event in New York, Fritz crossed the room to where she was standing, and he asked the 65-year-old mother of the woman he had been convicted of killing to dance with him, and she did. As jazz played in that room, the 2 people the system had positioned as opposites in the same tragedy stood together on a stage and chose something other than the grief and anger that would have been completely understandable. That image is not a resolution. It is not justice. It is something smaller and more stubborn than justice. 2 people deciding that the only thing left within their control was how they chose to face each other. This case reveals something that a single mistake cannot explain. It required 5 separate failures, each stacked on the one beneath it, to produce a death sentence for an innocent man. The first failure was the investigation's original blind spot. Gore was the last confirmed person with Carter before her death. He had been seen by multiple witnesses at her car. He walked away from 5 years of investigation without providing a single biological sample, while Williamson, who had an alibi his mother confirmed, gave everything police asked for. The second failure was the fingerprint reversal. The same expert, the same evidence, a completely opposite conclusion, delivered precisely when the prosecution needed a justification to move forward. No scientific explanation was offered then or afterward. The third failure was the suppression. 3 separate pieces of exculpatory evidence, any one of which could have broken the case open, were kept inside Peterson's files. That was not an administrative error. That was a choice made 3 separate times. The fourth failure was the science that was not science. Microscopic hair analysis presented to a jury as if it carried the certainty of a fingerprint, when the FBI would eventually admit it had never been validated. Defense attorneys who did not know enough to challenge it. A jury that had no way to know what the method could and could not actually determine. The fifth failure was the trial of a man in a psychotic state without any evaluation of whether he was mentally competent to stand trial, and the jury reading his psychosis as evidence of his character rather than as symptoms of an illness. No one in that courtroom had any obligation to explain the difference to them, and no one did. 5 failures, 22 combined years, 1 death sentence carried within 5 days of execution, 1 man who died at 51 with 5 years of freedom at the end, 1 woman who was murdered in 1982 and whose killer spent 17 years helping the system look the other way. There are things anyone can take from this case and apply to their own life. If you or anyone close to you is questioned by police in connection with any matter at all, request an attorney before answering anything, including questions that seem routine or harmless. Williamson described a dream without a lawyer present, and that description was used at trial as a confession. The conversational context that made it clearly a dream was not what the jury heard. If you have reason to believe that evidence favorable to you or someone you love is being withheld, have a lawyer file for complete discovery immediately. The Brady Rule exists for exactly that reason. The Innocence Project at innocenceproject.org and their line at 212-364-5340 are available to people who believe wrongful convictions have occurred. If mental illness is part of a defendant's history and charges are pending, a competency evaluation is a constitutional protection, and attorneys have an obligation to request one when signs of mental illness are present. The failure to do so in this case was one of the grounds on which Williamson's conviction was overturned. And if a case against you or someone you know relies on microscopic hair analysis, bite mark comparison, or other techniques that have since been identified as scientifically unreliable, ask your attorney about pursuing DNA testing. The FBI's formal acknowledgement of that unreliability changed the landscape of how those results can be challenged. Deborah Carter was 21 years old. She worked 3 jobs to afford an apartment of her own. She wore a belt with her name on it because she had built enough of a life to want something that was distinctly hers. She called her friend in the middle of the night and said someone was in her apartment and she was uncomfortable. And then she called back and said, "Never mind." That second call is the part of this story that never fully resolves. Whatever happened in the minutes between those 2 calls in that small apartment in Ada, Oklahoma, on the night of December 7, 1982, only one person ever fully knew. And that person spent the next 17 years pointing at someone else.